Four unmasked men, dressed as cotton pickers and carrying cotton sacks, humbly ambled into the Goodlet State Bank in the small town of Goodlet, Texas. That set the stage for a brazen, early morning bank robbery just after about 10 a.m. on October 17, 1927. Now, these weren't amateurs, as their humble gaits changed into movements of precision. Two stood guard at the door, pistols drawn, while the other two slipped behind the teller's counter. When a couple of customers walked in, the robbers didn't hesitate. They covered them with their guns, herding them along with two bank employees into the vault. And with an undetermined amount of cash stuffed into those cotton sacks, the bandits locked the vault and vanished. The robbers' escape was quiet and clean, and the folks they locked up in the vault were about to see their luck change for the better. A few minutes later, a customer named L.C. Hollow strolled into the bank and found it eerily empty. He discovered the four trapped in the vault and alerted H.D. Wrinkle, the bank's director, who happened to run a store across the street. Wrinkle sprang into action, freeing the group. Now, no one was injured, but the town was, as you can imagine, alerted, abuzz, and furious. Sheriff John Compton of Childress County assembled several posses, and he headed to an area called the Summers Break, which was a rugged area south of Goodlet. He was obviously hoping to track the culprits there. Now, officers from neighboring counties were notified, and they cast a wide net for the robbers, but as of October 1927, no arrests had been reported. This heist wasn't just a local scandal, but it is the type of story that we follow on Decades of Gangsters, from 1926 to 1941, when the United States enters World War II. It was a snapshot of the 1927 crime wave. Small town banks like Goodlet's were easy targets. They held cash, had minimal security, and were often miles from serious law enforcement. Now, add in fast cars, and outlaws could essentially hit and run before anyone really knew what happened. But Goodlet was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. While Goodlet was reeling, another bank robbery case was still reverberating in Texas. Back in August of 1925, a man named Yancy Story pulled off a heist at the Krum Bank in Denton County. We covered this story in a February 1926 video and discussed the old-time friendship between Dr. A.H. Knox, owner of the First State Bank, and robber and all-around criminal Yancy Story. The two had actually chatted the morning of the heist at the bank, and Story even joked to Knox that he was going to rob it. Knox just assumed he was kidding. Well, we don't have details on how much he took or if people were hurt, but we know that the law eventually caught up with him. Coming forward to late 1927, and Story's trial was set, but it had just hit a snag. Judge C.A. Bippen, presiding in the criminal district court, decided to transfer the case to Sherman, Texas. So why the move? It was likely to avoid local bias in Krum, Texas, where the robbery was, not surprisingly, big news. Sherman in Grayson County offered a fresh jury and a fairer shot at justice, or so the court hoped. Well, we covered much of the legal wranglings of Story's story, and spoiler alert, he ended up receiving 99 years for that crime and had, at the time, 16 additional serious charges pending. Bank robbers had popped up across Texas and Oklahoma, and frankly across the Midwest, and the courts were working overtime to keep up. So we'll head north to Oklahoma, where One man was making headlines not just for robbing banks, but for his ability to defy the law at seemingly every turn. With that, we now meet Elmer Inman, a man whose reputation was infamous. Recently, Oklahoma had crowned him their, quote, unofficial Bandit King for his knack for slipping through the law's fingers. Inman's story reads like a crime novel from that period. About 12 years earlier, so around 1915, he was a jewelry clerk in Arkansas City, Kansas. He was living a quiet life, but something flipped. Coming forward to 1921, he was in the Lansing Penitentiary in Kansas serving time for an unknown crime. There, Inman, in his personality, won or earned the trust of the warden, J.K. Cotting. He became a trustee and even served as the warden's chauffeur. That's where he met LaVonna Cotting, the warden's daughter. Here's where it gets wild. Inman was already married, but his wife divorced him, and he ended up eloping with LaVonna in 1921. So now we come forward to 1925, and Inman was back in trouble, this time arrested for robbing a jewelry store in Ardmore, Oklahoma. However, he didn't stay locked up for long. Teaming up with Ray Terrell, a member of the Notorious Matt Kimes gang, Inman broke out of jail. He fled to Oklahoma City, where he and a partner named Alvin Sherwood bought a suburban truck farm and posed as gentleman farmers. The neighbors were shocked when Inman and Sherwood were caught robbing a clothing store and arrested. Convicted yet again, Inman wasn't done. On their way to prison, he and Sherwood leaped through the window of the train and escaped. Inman was about 40 years old and was always sporting a, quote, spruce appearance, end quote. Well, he was also now a two-time escapee. Rumors swirled that he or an associate had killed a Wichita, Kansas police officer, adding murder to his growing rap sheet. Inman at some point reportedly said he'd rather die than face more prison time. That ability to evade capture and escape for months made him a legend and also kind of a headache for Oklahoma's law enforcement community. Inman's story shows how broader Roaring Twenties turned outlaws into folk heroes. His charm, his daring escapes, and even his romance with a warden's daughter kind of fed the public's fascination with a Robin Hood-like character. But not every criminal was a career outlaw. Our next story is about a young woman who shocked Texas with her crimes. Rebecca Bradley Rogers was no typical bank robber. At just 21 or 22, the former University of Texas graduate student was indicted for bank robbery and arson. While working on her master's degree, Rogers allegedly planned a daring bank heist. We covered her story initially in the video Bank Robbery Babe versus Bank Robbery Brutes in December 1926 and had numerous follow-ups along the way subsequently. But her initial scheme was to set a house on fire in Round Rock, Texas. The plan was to lure employees out of the bank, and she was going to go in and rob it. But that plan failed. She then successfully hit the Farmers National Bank in nearby Buda, Texas. That plan worked. Unfortunately for her, the law caught up pretty quickly. In October of 1927, Rogers faced trial for the arson part of her plan in San Angelo, Texas. The evidence was mostly circumstantial, and her defense team leaned hard on an insanity plea. There were alienists, the early version and early name of psychologists, who testified showing that she had, quote, no sense of right or wrong, end quote. After about 20 hours of deliberation, the jury split on the arson charge, 9 for conviction, 3 for acquittal. Judge Cooper Sansom declared it a mistrial. Rebecca Rogers stayed composed and aloof, though she was disappointed that more jurors hadn't seen it her way. As she left the courtroom on her husband and lead defense attorney Otis Rogers' arm. Otis had been recovering from tuberculosis in a sanitarium in San Angelo and stayed silent on the verdict. Rogers returned to her stenographer job in San Angelo, but another trial loomed. On December 5th, 1927, she was set to face charges in LaGrange, Texas, for the Buddha bank robbery. Prosecutor Harry Dolan was confident that he would secure a conviction next time, while Rogers' defense planned to essentially double down on the insanity plea. Not surprisingly, the press couldn't get enough of the, quote, pretty brown-haired co-ed, end quote, turned criminal, in part because it was such a stark contrast to the grizzled gangsters that we imagine. Now we bounce back north to Oklahoma, and there were 2 other cases grabbing headlines. Matt Kimes, mentioned earlier, now a convicted murderer and bank robber, tied to the same gang as Inman's new pal Ray Terrell, narrowly escaped the electric chair in 1927. District Judge James M. Hayes set aside the death penalty and ordered a new trial. Kimes was sent back to McAllister State Penitentiary to await his next day in court, though at the time no date had been set. Meanwhile, an M.C. Woodson of Tulsa, Oklahoma, wasn't so lucky. Just 3 weeks before, he'd robbed the First National Bank in Eddy, Oklahoma. He successfully made off with $1,501. But the law moved fast, and Woodson was captured, arrested, and sentenced to 20 years in the penitentiary. These cases, Kimes and Woodson and Rogers and Inman and the Goodlet heist, showed a 1927 America wrestling with a large, broad crime wave. Even the famous humorist, known as Oklahoma's favorite son, Will Rogers, couldn't resist weighing in. At the American Bankers Association annual benefit in 1927, he joked about the rise of branch banks, saying they were built to, quote, bring the bank nearer the robber, end quote. He also quipped, quote, the branch bank is the robber's only salvation, end quote. Rogers' wit and humor hit home, as banks were indeed expanding, but so was the ease of robbing them. Next Saturday, we tackle Colorado, Nevada, and we have a return of the California crime wave we thought had been put to rest in September.